without this income from these. I just, we need it. Anyway, here's how the episode on submarines from the Cold War starts. I'll just read you the first paragraph just because I like it. I'll read you the first couple paragraphs just because I like them. On April 1st, 1960, a 19-year-old Filipino fisherman named Rufino Bering hastily paddled his dugout canoe back to Punta, I think it's Angora, on Mactan Island. He leapt ashore, terrified of what he'd seen, the tentacles of a black sea monster out in the open ocean not 50 yards away from where he'd dropped his line. "I was very frightened," said Rufino to a skeptical audience, presumably not impressed by the fact that it was April Fool's Day. "I tried to get away as fast as I could." Needless to say, most of his fellow villagers thought he'd been seeing things, but Rufino was telling the truth. He had indeed been seeing things. He was, in fact, the only person in the world who had sighted the sea monster, a sea monster which had taken a photograph of the young fisherman in his canoe, his face lost in the shadow of his wide-brim hat, looking exactly the way you would look if you were a 19-year-old in a canoe and about to get the hell out of there as fast as you possibly could. Aboard the sea monster, the man who snapped the photo later had this to say about the strange encounter, quote, "It's a ludicrous situation. On one hand, a passive Asian staring with curious concentration at an unusual object in the water. On the other, a U.S. Navy officer, equipped with all technical devices money and science can procure, looking back with equally studied concentration. On one end of the periscope, an outrigger canoe propelled by the brawny arms of its builder. On the other end, a $100 million submarine, the newest, biggest, most powerful in the world, on a history-making voyage. What an abyss! What centuries of scientific development lie between him and me." The man at the other end of the periscope was U.S. Navy Captain Edward L. Beach, Jr., commander of what was at the time the largest and most expensive submarine in human history, SSRN 586 USS Triton, and his encounter with Rufino during day 37 of his 61-day mission marked the first and only time that anyone outside of the men actually on board the top-secret mission managed to catch even a glimpse of the Triton, as she became the first sub ever to sail around the world all the time, to sail all the way around the planet while underwater the entire time. And that's how it starts. It's a great story. And I'd heard the story about the Triton. I'd heard about the circumnavigation of the globe by the Triton. I hadn't realized when I'd heard the story that they originally was going to be called Project Magellan and followed Magellan's route as closely as it possibly could. But they went around the world underwater and were detected only by one person, which was a Filipino fisherman, 19-year-old guy in his canoe out fishing, who saw the periscope of the Triton and paddled back home on April Fool's Day to report that he had seen a sea monster. The mission was called Operation Sandblast. It was originally called Project Magellan, but since it was top secret, that seemed a little bit too much on the nose, so they decided to call it Operation Sandblast. They called it Operation Sandblast partially because of Captain Beach, and mostly because Captain Beach, when he was told about the mission, said, it's going to take a lot of sand to do that. Take a lot of sand, meaning guts, sail around the world underwater 60 days. Now, I have to tell you, I was a little bit disappointed by two things that I had thought I'd known about the mission. It turned out not to be true. The first thing I'd heard about the mission was that basically Triton submerged just outside the bay, and I remember somebody telling me that it surfaced at the pier, which of course is ridiculous when you think about it, but nevertheless I kind of believed that wasn't true. The other thing that wasn't true was, to be perfectly honest, it didn't completely sail around the world. Let me rephrase that. Triton sailed around the world underwater, and it took her 61 days to do it, but she didn't make the trip without surfacing. One of the crewmen had kidney stones. They got worse and worse and worse, so they surfaced and transferred him onto transferred him to a boat. She went back down and continued her voyage. But the thing I didn't know about Triton was that she's nuclear powered. She's the only submarine ever built by the United States Navy with two reactors. And so that's why she was chosen for this mission. But at the time in 60? Yeah. In February through April of 1960, they still didn't know enough about nuclear submarines to be able to have figured out how to crack oxygen from seawater yet. You can do this with a nuclear-powered sub today and have been for quite a long time. You use the electricity that the reactors generated not only to power the screws, or the screw, I should say, in most cases, but you can also use that electricity to, hydrolyze? You pass electricity through seawater and it gives off hydrogen and oxygen. So essentially now, in a nuclear sub, you're limited by how much food you can carry. The sub makes its own oxygen and carbon dioxide. Chemical scrubbers pull the carbon dioxide out of the air. Same problem with Apollo 13. It wasn't that they were out of oxygen, it's that the carbon dioxide was building up too fast. Electrolyze, that's the word, thank you. So they were able to, for decades and decades now, a nuclear sub can stay underwater as long as it wants to. The crew is limited by how much food they can carry. But for the mission for Operation Sandblast, they didn't have that technology yet. So Triton, even though it was a nuclear sub, had to come up to snorkel depth frequently just to replenish the air. But she did it, sailed around the world underwater. And it was supposed to be a big kind of a technological bragging point for Eisenhower's Paris summit with Nikita Khrushchev in May. They got back on 24th of April. Big announcement. We've sailed around the world underwater. Big summit was planned for May. And then on May 1st, about, I think, exactly a week after Triton came back home, Francis Gary Powers got shot down in his U-2. And that was not only the end of Triton being in the news, but also was the end of the summit and beginning of a real big freeze in the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis followed almost as a direct result of that, and things really got ugly then. Well, one of the things that I found that's really cool, and how all these threads occasionally tie together, is that, and I've forgotten his name. It's not my fault. It's research I just did. It sounds an awful lot like Patagonsky. There's a U.S. CIA agent. He was involved with Project Aquitaine, which was the U-2 project. And then after the U-2 got shot down, they needed reconnaissance, obviously, of the Soviet Union. They had Project Corona. Corona was the first reconnaissance satellite, and it was so primitive that Corona would orbit above the Soviet Union. They'd take the pictures they'd want to, and then Corona would eject, spit out this film cartridge, which would then re-enter the atmosphere, and a little chute would come out, and then an airplane with whiskers on it, like catfish, would catch this parachute in midair, and they'd take the reel of film back and develop it. That's what the first satellites were. They were film cameras, a tremendous resolution, but you literally had to pick up the film from the damn satellite and develop it, and that takes time, and they didn't have time. And sometimes you need a quick picture. So after the Soviets shot down Francis Gary Powers in the U-2 in May Day of 1960, the CIA, who had run the U-2 program, had talked with Eisenhower and then on with Kennedy and so on. I said, we need the ability to have pictures quickly. What the U-2 was doing, we need to be able to do. Sometimes you run into little sentences that you never heard before, and they become like almost the most important part of the story. But the U-2 pilots, the U-2 is a very long-wing aircraft, but it's a slow airplane, and it's designed just for lift. I've forgotten the exact numbers, but I want to say it's very close to this. There's something like 4 knots, which is more or less 4 miles an hour difference between flying the U-2 so slow. This is at altitude now. If you fly the U-2 4 miles an hour too slowly, you stall the airplane. If you fly it more than 4 miles an hour indicated airspeed faster than that, then the ship comes apart. That the actual envelope of safe operation for the U-2 at 70,000 feet or whatever is something like 4 knots. That's why these pilots have to be profoundly well trained. Anyway, it was a slow airplane, and it flew high, but it didn't fly fast enough. So sooner or later, the Soviets developed their surface-to-air missiles and shot down a couple of them, actually. So the CIA wanted this capability, and they went to Kelly Johnson, who developed the U-2, and they said, Mr. Johnson, you're a genius, and we need something better. And Kelly Johnson said, well, I'm not gonna do an upgraded U-2. If we're going to do something better, I want to do something orders of magnitude better, something that's going to stay ahead of this arms race for at least enough years for us to get some useful intel out of it. So the CIA said, well, here's a check. Off you go. And Kelly Johnson and the Lockheed Skunk Works developed an aircraft called the A-12. Now, everybody knows it as the SR-71, but the SR-71 is actually a slightly smaller version of the original CIA project, which was called Project Oxcart. Oxcart was the program that developed the A-12. The A-12 single-seater was the successor to the U-2, and it was the fastest aircraft ever built to this day. Mach 3. It would fly at 80,000, 85,000 feet, and it would do it at 3 times the speed of sound. I think they've launched various nations, not just the Soviets. I think more than 1,000 missiles, surface-to-air missiles, more than 1,000 have been launched at the A-12 SR-71 in the course of its lifespan, and they never touched it. Unlike the U-2, which flew high, the SR-71 flew high and fast. The A-12 and later the SR-71, you really have to have a good eye. They're virtually indistinguishable. If you didn't really know your stuff, you'd have a hard time telling them two apart, because obviously the SR-71 Blackbird is a immediate descendant of the A-12, but the A-12 came first, and the A-12 had so many engineering problems to solve. One of them was the thing was flying so fast that it would heat up so much that it would literally melt the aluminum on the skin. Once the thing got up to, and we're not done with submarines yet, by the way, Mr. AK-47 for now. It's all connected in the vast scheme of things, you see. I'm taking you on a little journey here. So the SR-71 was going to fly so fast that if they built it out of aluminum, then it would melt. The plane would melt from atmospheric friction. So they had to build it out of something else. So they decided to build it out of titanium. And they had to buy virtually all of the titanium in the world, including the ones that the Russians had, kind of under their nose in order to make this bird. And titanium, this is titanium, by the way, right here. Titanium's great stuff, kind of a cool silver color. It's the strongest metal known to man. It's relatively lightweight. It's far stronger than steel. So then the question becomes, okay, so you're going to make a plane out of titanium? Yes, we are. Awesome. Fantastic. That'll be so cool. Yeah. So how are you going to make this airplane out of the hardest metal that there is? We're just going to bend it and, that's kind of a tough question. How do you make something out of the hardest metal there is? It's a problem. The biggest problem was the engines. The engines had to develop enough thrust to take. It's a sleek-looking airplane. Needless to say, if you've ever seen the SR-71, it's just there's a SR-71 at the museum here in Los Angeles at the Science Center, and unlike most of them on display, it's got its black reflective paint stripped off it. It's radar-absorbing paint stripped off it, and it's down to the bare metal. And the SR-71 looks like it's made out of fitted diamonds. When you take the paint off of the SR-71 and you look at it, even today, what's that, 60 years practically after it flew for the first time, even 60 years after it first flew and long after it retired, it in its unpainted state, the aircraft looks like it was made by Vulcans and teleported back to 2020, 400 years into the past. It is an astonishing airplane. Of all the many problems I had to solve with the A-12 SR-71 was the fact that if you're going to heat this thing up, I forget what the surface temperature gets to be. I want to say it's about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so what they realized was if we're going to fly this plane that fast, the plane's going to get that hot, it's going to expand. So what the hell do we do about that? You can't have the plane expanding past its rivets because then it just disintegrates. And you can't damn it, Jim, you can't change the laws of physics. So what they did was they actually built the plane small. They built the airplane so that when it heated up, it would expand into its final flight shape. Bo Monday just put up a link to an unpainted 71 picture. Let me see if, yeah, that's it. It looks like it's absolutely astonishing. It's much, much, much more interesting without the paint than with it. I can't recommend that highly enough if you get a chance to look at that. It's absolutely astonishing, and really shows you what the Lockheed team under Kelly Johnson was able to do. Anyway, so if you've got an airplane that flies that fast, you basically have to have two different sizes of airplane. You have to have the airplane that's the size it wants to be at normal temperature, 79 degrees or whatever, 59 degrees for standard atmosphere. I forget what those numbers are now, if that sounds right. And at the same time, you have to have something that's going to expand to its size when it's at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. So what they had to do was they had to build the plane small so that it would expand into its flight size. And that meant that when you fueled this thing on the runway, the fuel tanks were leaking because the fuel tanks wouldn't close. The fuel tanks only closed when the plane was going fast enough to expand the tanks and all the rest of the fittings to seal the actual ship. And when they say that these things leaked on the ground, I thought, oh, okay, so it looks like a kind of a fuel leak kind of thing, like maybe an air conditioning leak under your car or something, You'd see the SR-71 or something, and you'd see little droplets coming off. No, rivers of fuel were coming off of this thing. It was like somebody was hosing it down. So they had to take off light, get the guys in the bird, get her ready to go, get her full of as little fuel as she could take, get the thing off the ground, up to a tanker, hit a tanker, and then go. An SR-71, I think it might have been the last SR-71 flight of all time, hit a tanker off the Pacific coast, lit the burners, crossed Los Angeles at Mach 3 at 85,000 feet, and made it to New York in, I want to say, 63 minutes. Just over an hour. Maybe it was 57 minutes, just under an hour, but it was something like that. Hard to believe that the SR-71 at the A-12, was, but at this point, less than halfway. If you take the Wright brothers in 1903 and you take where we are today, the SR-71 comes well before the halfway point in aviation. It's as fast as we've ever gone, as fast as we're likely to go for the foreseeable future, at least in terms of manned aircraft. Anyway, as it turns out, the people who were working on the U-2 project moved over to the SR-71 project. So far, so good. They had more work ahead of them. These are CIA guys. So here we go back to the subs again. So then I started drilling down after I read about Triton, and I had another disappointment about the Triton too. For some reason, I thought the Triton looked an awful lot like the early missile boats, like a Ethan Allen class or George Washington class, traditional looking sub with a rounded nose and the sail, and the Americans always mounted the dive planes up on the sail. They don't do that anymore, but did at the time. And that's what I thought she looked like, but Triton didn't look like that at all. Triton looked almost exactly like Nautilus. So then in this episode I just wrote, we started talking a little bit about the Nautilus. 3 or 4 years before Triton sailed around the world underwater, USS Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine, launched, I want to say, in 1954. I've got the actual dates. I'm just doing this from memory. Shoved off from the pier, and the captain said, "We are underway on nuclear power." Tooled around out in the Pacific for a while, and then decided just to prove a point. They submerged off the coast of Alaska, headed north, sailed right underneath the North Pole, and then emerged just northwest of Greenland. It was Operation Sunshine. So even though they're doing the missions, they still don't know what they've got. They don't realize that not fully anyway, the power of a nuclear sub, the idea that a submarine could stay underwater for as long as it wanted to and fire ballistic missiles as well. But basically, the Nautilus the Nautilus was the first nuclear submarine, and even when they were doing her sea trials, they realized, starting to get a sense that this was going to be a game changer. Needless to say, we're talking about the Cold War now, not the post-Cold War, but during the Cold War, the definitive strategic instrument wasn't the aircraft carrier; it was the nuclear submarine, and hunting other nuclear submarines and ballistic subs and so on. So anyway, all of our subs prior to Nautilus were SS for subsurface, SS 14 in the very, very early days of the war, and then so on. But Nautilus, I want to say, was SSN 571, if I ring a bell. SSN for subsurface nuclear, and you look at Nautilus, and Nautilus is clearly not a modern sub, but it's clearly not a World War II sub either. It's got the dimensions of a boat. It's got a pointy nose like a boat, and it sits relatively high in the water like a boat does for a submarine anyway. It doesn't look anything like a modern submarine. Looks a lot like a World War II sub, and that doesn't surprise you much since it was commissioned in, I want to say 51 maybe? Not commissioned, laid down in 51. In any event, Nautilus looks like a World War II boat because that's essentially what she was. After the war, they converted a number of U.S. Pacific Fleet subs like the Gato class and Kavala class and so on. And they smoothed them up, and they took all those tubes away on the sail where the World War II boats, and they took the deck gun off and all of this super, super, super draggy stuff and smoothed it out and streamlined it and gave it better propulsion. It was called the Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Project, and they called them Guppy subs. And the Guppy subs showed that if you decided to clean up the submarine and not have deck guns and railings and tubes and all the rest of this stuff, if you decide to get rid of all of that, you can make your sub go a lot faster with a lot less power and more quietly. And this is when the change started to happen. They started to realize what they did. So Nautilus comes out, and in the episode I refer to a photograph that I saw. It's a photograph of 3 subs tied up next to a sub-tender in 1962. Sounds about right. So you got the sub-tender, which is a surface ship. Kind of an ugly little surface ship, but it's designed to tend submarines. That's why they call it a sub-tender. And tied up next to it is Triton. And Triton is not a good-looking sub. Triton is a big version of the Nautilus, and it looks like it's half again bigger than the Nautilus, and it's got a very, very big sail, big square sails. It turned out Triton was built for a mission, and by the time they launched Triton, the mission was obsolete. Triton was a SSRN, subsurface reconnaissance nuclear. Triton's mission was to be a picket sub. It would sail out into the Pacific, stay there for as long as it wanted to, and just keep up radar coverage of the West Coast. But by the time they finally rolled Triton off the ways, we had ground-based radars that could accomplish that. So Triton really didn't have a mission. It just, by the time it was in the ocean, it was obsolete. So in this picture, there's Triton. Next to it is Nautilus, and they look practically identical. Twin screws, kind of a bow that just kind of tapers, so it's got a pointy bow, and looks like it belongs on the surface because that's what submarines did. They spent almost all their time on the surface. They would just submerge when they wanted to. And then on the other side of Nautilus is a sub that looks like it's half the size of Nautilus. Turns out it's not, but it looks like it is because it sits much, much lower in the water. The only thing that you're able to see out of that sub, this little bathtub toy sub, is the sail, which people often erroneously call the conning tower. And up on the sail are the forward dive planes, kind of iconic American look on this thing. And the third sub was USS Skipjack. Skipjack looks like the future because it was. If you saw Skipjack today, you would say that's a modern submarine. You wouldn't say that about Triton. You wouldn't say that about Nautilus. But you saw the Skipjack, you'd say it's a modern sub. And the reason you'd say that is because it's shaped like a teardrop. It's shaped like a tuna, which is what a Skipjack is, a kind of tuna. And she looks completely different than the other 2 boats. The Skipjack is astonishing, fast, quiet, quick. It looks deadly. The Skipjack looks like the future. As a matter of fact, I don't remember can look it up. I'm not going to. I am actually, come to think of it. The number's worth looking up. It's so spectacular. Give me a second here. I'll get you the exact numbers because they're worth it. Come here, you. So Skipjack. Here we go. Skipjack was commissioned at the same time I was, April of 1959. And it was so far ahead of its time that it remained in active duty until she was finally cut into millions of pieces of razor blades, which began when she was decommissioned on April 19th, 1990. From 1959 to 1990. That's 11,327 days, 31 years in service for USS Skipjack. Oh, Bo Monday has shown the picture in the comments section. See, this is what you get when you watch the Stratosphere Lounge live, folks. You get to see all kinds of cool stuff that those of you on YouTube miss. So anyway, yeah, 11,327 days on active duty service. But Skipjack wasn't the first teardrop-shaped hull. Once again, the American Navy, U.S. Navy, decided to do this kind of the right way. They did it incrementally. Nautilus was never really intended to be a fighting ship. She carried torpedoes like everything else, but she was a test bed. It was pretty well understood that Nautilus was an experimental sub and that was never really intended to be a fighting sub. And Skipjack was a fighting sub, but Skipjack's predecessor wasn't. Skipjack was not the first submarine to have a teardrop shape. That particular honor and distinction goes to USS Albacore. Albacore was a conventional boat. It was a diesel-electric boat, but it was the first time they'd ever tested this hydrodynamically clean shape. And what's interesting about the shape of, when I say Albacore, Skipjack, all of them, all the submarines you've ever seen, are all based on what they did with Albacore. Albacore wasn't nuclear powered, but Albacore was slick. And what's interesting about Albacore is that it was well known long before they built Albacore that if you have this teardrop shape and the sub is moving on the surface, it's going to be much draggier on the surface than a boat like Nautilus or Triton. And every single submarine up until the point where we get to, realistically, Skipjack, was designed to be on the surface. Even though Nautilus could stay underwater for about as long as it also had to replenish its air, but the point is Nautilus could stay underwater as long as it damn near wanted to. And they hadn't caught up with the design of it. The reactor was there, propulsion was there, but the hull wasn't there. Albacore was a conventional diesel-electric boat, but Albacore looks like a modern sub. And if you take the nuclear power plant out of the Nautilus and put it in the teardrop shape of the Albacore, which is another kind of a tuna, fastest fish in the ocean, skipjacks and albacores, put the reactor from the Nautilus inside the hull shape of the Albacore, you get Skipjack. And Skipjack was like I said, what's the number again? It was in active duty for 11,327 days, 31 years in active service. That's how far ahead of its time Skipjack was. So I'm continuing to tell this story, and I'm saying, okay, so what were the Soviets doing? What were the Russians doing? Well, the Cold War, when you really look back on it, having written so much about it now, I realize the entire Cold War was just a 42-year-long publicity stunt. In so many ways, since you weren't fighting with bullets or tanks, you were fighting with ideas. And that's how the space race got to be this first, that first. It's a first. It's a first. A first two-man mission, first three-man mission, first spacewalk. Dun-dun-dun, we're better than you are. And that was one of the reasons why Triton sailed around the world, was to show superiority of American sub technology. Nautilus comes out. 5 years go by. The Soviets still don't have a nuclear sub. Triton sails all the way around the world, underwater, comes back, and the Soviets still don't have a nuclear sub. But finally they did. They finally got their first nuclear sub out. And her name was K-19. Let me tell you a little bit about K-19. This is what happened to K-19 as she was being built. Well, I'll just read again. Those of you who are going to be subscribing to the podcast will not get a discount for having heard this material in advance. K-19 had been plagued with problems from the moment she was designed and rushed into production. Her keel was laid down on October 17, 1958. But before long, 2 workers were killed when a fire broke out inside the partially completed hull. Not too much later, 6 women workers were gluing a rubber lining to a water cistern aboard the boat. When fumes from the adhesive overcame them in a confined space, all 6 of them died. Let's see. K-19, however, unlike Nautilus, which was a testbed, K-19 was designed to be a fighting sub. She carried 3 R-13 missiles in her sail, vertically mounted in the sail there. When they were loading the missiles prior to launching the boat, one of the missile tube caps came loose and crushed an electrician to death. A little later, before she sailed, an engineer fell between 2 spaces before the hull was completely sealed up. That person was killed. And so even before the boat's even in the water, there are 10 Russians dead. And sailors are all very superstitious people, and sub-sailors even more so. Just way to deal with the stress. So needless to say, before K-19 even hits the water, she's considered a bad luck boat. That was not enhanced when she was christened on April 8th, 1959, which is, as you probably know, a historic date because it comes right after April 7th, 1959, which is clearly, I think, undoubtedly one of history's most significant dates for reasons that should be obvious at this point. So the day after I was born, they christened K-19. Now, usually you have a woman christen a boat. You take a champagne glass and smash it over the front of the boat, the idea being that the first fluids that touch the bow is champagne, and that's good luck. Well, the Soviets decided not to use a woman to christen K-19. She was christened by a Soviet naval officer, had a bottle of champagne on a swinging rope kind of thing. He throws the bottle of champagne against the hull, which is coated with rubber in order to reduce the sound signature, and the champagne bottle bounces off the hull and just goes doink, 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 doink. Just lands there, just hanging there on the side of the boat. That didn't make the sailors too happy either. Let's see. It gets more and more interesting, sad, appalling. Here's what else happened. She's getting ready. It's K-19 now, the first Soviet nuclear sub. Nautilus, just essentially perfect. And I say in this episode that Nautilus currently is tied up in Groton. Somebody's going to tell me the right name. And Nautilus, today in 2020, you could walk up to the Nautilus and think that she just rolled off the waves and was ready to begin her career. She is in immaculate condition. That boat looks like it was launched yesterday. It's absolutely perfectly preserved as a floating museum up at the Submarine Museum in Groton. But K-19 wasn't that lucky. So you had 10 people killed in its construction. And then when she was getting ready for sea trials, a confusion among shift crews, one shift coming in, the other shift coming out, caused them to bend one of the control rods in the reactor. That meant that the entire reactor had to be disassembled. And that took another 6 months off of the time. And you got to understand, every second that goes by, the Americans are out there with their nuclear navy, and the Soviets need something to show. And Triton's sailing around the world, and meanwhile, this crew shift caused them to basically break the reactors. They had to tear that down and build it again. So finally, in January of 1960, she had that accident. Triton returns from a round-the-world trip in April. In November of 1960, they take K-19 out for her sea trials, and as they're getting ready to commission the boat, they take her down for a dive. Turns out that there's a leak. Captain takes her back up to the surface. She surfaces and she's listing heavily to port because she's taken on so much water, so they take her back to port. Find out that a technician had forgot to install a diaphragm or some kind of a gasket someplace. Just forgot to put it in. So it's a miracle the boat was still there. So they said, okay, well, now we got that fixed as well. Let's take her out. And they tried to take her out again, but the crew, Groton, thank you, AK-47, and they're getting ready to get this thing out finally to sea, and it turns out that the galley crew, the guys in the kitchen, had a wooden crate filled with vegetables, and then when they'd taken the vegetables out and stowed them, they wanted to get rid of the crate. So they broke the crate up into little pieces and tried to flush it down the toilet. That backed up everything, caused one of the compartments to flood, and so they had to haul the ship back in and clear out the clog in the toilet and fix that connection and so on. You're beginning to get the idea, I imagine. So she had a pump fail on a reactor core, had to be brought back in again, but finally she sails on April 30th, 1961. And then from then on, K-19 functions absolutely smoothly for about 2 months. On the 4th of July, 1961, while performing exercises in the North Atlantic, one of the coolant pumps, K-19 had 2 reactors, most Soviet subs do. The starboard reactor on K-19 coolant pressure went to 0. And they looked inside the containment and they realized that there had been this enormous leak, that one of the pipes that was taking cooling water to the reactor core had ruptured and was just the water from the cooling pipes was everywhere, which meant that the core's not getting cooled, which is not good. So they scrammed the reactors and they put the control rods in, which is supposed to stop the nuclear process, but the reactor's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. At one point it reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, which coincidentally is about the temperature of a A-12 at full speed. So now the captain has to make a decision. The radio, the long-range radio that they would have used to call Moscow for instructions and for rescue, had been disabled by a previous accident. Something else had knocked it out. So they couldn't call home. And what they realized was they had a runaway reactor, and that if they didn't do something fast, that reactor was going to get so hot it was going to melt through the bottom of K-19 and take the whole boat with it. So Captain Zatayev and Executive Officer Archipov, who I mentioned in a previous episode, one of the guys who saved the world pretty much single-handedly, had to make a decision. So what they did was they decided that they would, that they had no choice. They looked around. They found something in an air vent that looked about the right size, kind of a valve. And they basically said to the engineering department, you guys are going to have to go in there, take this piece of metal, put it around the leak, and tighten it up. We got to get some kind of water into this core, or else the boat's gone. So they open up the containment to the reactor core, one of the reactors, and there's so much radiation in the room that the entire boat's contaminated, the hull's contaminated, the missiles are contaminated, the crew gets a massive dose of radiation. 7 sailors and an officer go in there to work on this thing. They manage to get this thing tightened up. They get the water flowing. The pressure comes back up, not all the way, but enough. Takes the core down to a point where it looks like the boat's going to be saved. All 8 of the men that went in there to make those repairs died from radiation poisoning within a month. 15 more crewmen were going to die within the next 2 years. But they saved the boat. So he sends out a distress call on the short-range radio. U.S. warships pick it up, offer to help. Zatayev says, no thank you. Sails south where he knows that there's a couple of Soviet conventional subs working. He sails south, finds S-270, it's a conventional Soviet sub. They transfer the crew over, and then they tow K-19 back to port. When she gets to port, she's so radioactive that she contaminates an area 1 mile in diameter. No one can get any closer than that without very good radiation protection. The core that had failed, the radioactive core that had failed, the Soviet Navy took out of the K-19, steamed out into the Kara Sea. Just took the reactor, put it in lead, went out to sea and chucked it overboard. So it's sitting at the bottom of the Kara Sea right now and is going to be radioactive for several tens of thousands of years, I suppose. And some people have pointed out, as I point out in the script, they made a really pretty good movie about this with Harrison Ford back in 2002 called K-19, The Widowmaker. And it's generally a pretty accurate movie. But one of the things that it was most inaccurate about was that the Russians and the sailors aboard her especially never, ever called the K-19 the Widowmaker. They called K-19 Hiroshima. That was the name they gave to the boat. So 2 years to get her refit and sailed out. In 1969, K-19 is out there, and 200 feet below the Barents Sea, she collides with USS Gatto. It was a class of Gatto boats in World War II that were famous, but this is SSN 615 USS Gatto, Permit class hunter-killer sub. It's an upgraded skipjack, basically. They collide under the Barents Sea, knocks the front of K-19's bow completely off. The sonar is completely ruined. K-19 blows its emergency tanks to surface, and USS Gatto just continues on her way as if nothing happened. I want to say there's another, fire broke out on board K-19 in 1972. When it was 400 feet below the surface, 28 Russian sailors died in that incident, and another 2 died after being transferred to the rescue ship. On August 15th of 1982, an electrical short circuit burned 2 Soviet sailors. One of them eventually died from his injuries. So the boat had killed very nearly 100 Soviet sailors. That's who the boat killed, not the enemy. And I kind of say the difference between who won the Cold War and who lost the Cold War can best be summed up, I think, in the one single picture that best shows that is to show today in 2020, USS Nautilus looks so perfectly maintained that she could head out to sea tomorrow. She looks brand new. Last photograph of K-19 is an orange hull that's rusted sideways. It's half filled with water. It's completely corroded away. You can see the ribs on it and so on. It's an absolute wreck. And just when we're about to say, hey, go USA, how amazing we are, wow, woohoo, then we have to take a little step back, because in 1961, K-19 banged into the USS Gatto, which is a Permit class sub, and they named subs for the first ship of the class. Only the USS Permit was not the first ship of the class. She was the second ship of the class. First ship of the class, the upgraded skipjack, was USS Thresher. And in 1963, USS Thresher had completed a pretty extensive overhaul, and she went out to sea for sea trials. Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Harvey was commander, USS Thresher. On April 9th, they went out to sea, not too far off the coast of New England, where the sub was based. And they went with a submarine rescue ship just for a precaution called USS Skylark. A standard procedure. There was a major overhaul, so they're just doing everything incrementally and carefully and so on. So Thresher goes down to about half of her test depth, comes back up again. Test depth on a sub's about like the BNE, like the red line on an airplane. Doesn't mean the plane's going to fall apart if you go beyond that, but it does mean that if you go beyond the red line, all bets are off. The boat or the plane is certified to VNE on an airplane. That's the red line on the airspeed indicator. And test depth is the guaranteed depth that the sub will survive to. You're guaranteed to test depth. Beyond that, nobody knows. So Thresher went down about halfway to test depth to 2 dives. Stayed underwater overnight. In the morning of the 10th of April, using the underwater telephone, she contacts USS Skylark, tiny little, itty-bitty little ship, looked like almost like a World War I destroyer. And Thresher gets contact again with Skylark, and Thresher starts to do a big wide circle around Skylark. And she's going deeper and deeper. They're going to try and take her deep now. And every 100 feet, they stop, level off, keep circling, and then when everything's okay, then they go down deeper and deeper. Somewhere before she got to test depth, I don't know what the actual official test depth for Thresher was, but it was pretty near 1,000 feet. They were well short of that. They were probably at 800 feet, something of that nature. And Skylark gets a garbled message on the underwater telephone that says, minor difficulties, we have positive up angle attempting to blow. And then there's silence, and then there's an even more garbled message. And all they could make out of that was the number 900. Likely that was 900 feet, which means they're going down, and which means they're approaching their test depth. And more time passes, and finally the last message, heavily garbled message, is heard, and the only intelligible fragment of that was exceeding test depth. And Thresher was never heard from again. So the joke's on the Americans, huh? The Soviets, with their boats and all their accidents and all that stuff, and we've got these amazing, super advanced boats that just shake off collisions. And Gatto shook off a collision with K-19, but Gatto was a Thresher-class boat, and the Thresher sank, and it took 127 Americans with it. Sorry, is that right? 129. 129 Americans went down with the Thresher. They found it pretty fast, needless to say. I mean, the submarine rescue boat's directly ahead. They found the wreckage of the Thresher 8,400 feet below the surface. But Thresher's test depth was 1,000 feet. Her crush depth was anywhere between 1,300 and 2,000. Nobody knows exactly, but certainly nobody survived to make it to the bottom. They found they had acoustic recordings of the boat, but they weren't nearly as clear as they would be in later years. And the best guess now is that Thresher developed a leak in the reactor room. It wasn't a leak of the coolant. It was a leak, external leak, which wasn't fatal. Started to flood the reactor room. That shut the reactor down. Most people think that subs control their buoyancy by, well, they control their climbing and diving ability by, by buoyancy, by changing the ratio of water and air in the buoyancy tanks. But it's not true. They trim the boat out for more or less neutral, and then pretty much all of the boat's maneuvers are conducted by the planes. Get the boat more or less neutral in buoyancy. And if you want to go up, you put the bow planes up and the stern planes down, and up she goes. You drive her up, you drive her down. So now you've got Thresher just 100 feet or so above her test depth. Reactor shuts down because of water. They try to start the boat. Try to restart the reactor. It's going to take 7 minutes to restart the reactor cold, because once it goes out, it scrams, control rods go in, they have to restart the reactor. So the first message from the captain saying minor difficulties, have positive up angle, attempting to blow. Basically, he's taking on water in the back of the boat. He doesn't have any power anymore. So he switches to his batteries. The batteries will drive the sub up to the surface. But apparently, she was taking on enough water by that point where they could not power the boat to the surface. It was just too heavy at this point. So they blew the emergency ballast tanks. They let out this compressed air, blew the water out of these tanks, which would make the boat very positively buoyant. It would pop up to the surface like a cork. And they later discovered that the air inside the tanks of Thresher was particularly humid air. And when you release pressure, if you ever done this on a car tire, for example, when air is being released from a high pressure area to a low pressure area, it cools down, and cools down fast. It gets very cold. That's how air conditioning works, as a matter of fact. And what they found out in later tests was that when they blew the emergency tanks, there was enough water in the air so that as these tanks started blowing, that formed ice on the valve. And the more the tanks blew, the more ice formed, until finally, after just a second or two, the ice covered the valve, and then there's no more air coming out, so you don't get the ballast tanks blown. So now Thresher's going down by the stern, and there's a message saying 900 feet. Seems pretty clear what that message was. And then the last message was she was exceeding her test depth and heading down by the stern. The only good news in all of this is that we've all seen these sub movies, and there's two particularly horrible kinds of death that we're used to seeing in submarines. Most of this came from World War II, some of it from World War I. But for instance, in World War II, if you were in a German U-boat and you were in the North Sea or the English Channel, most people don't know this. The water in the English Channel is 50 feet deep, maybe 40 feet deep. They several times had cruisers just sink in the North Sea, and then the stern of the ship is sticking up out of the water. So when a submarine would sink in 100, 200 feet of water, then you might have a situation where the water's pouring in and they drown, or they are stuck on the bottom and they run out of air and all of that horror. But That has not been the case in a long time. What happened to Thresher is that as she got to crush depth, the hull gives way all at once. And it's essentially a little air bubble. The hull is a little bubble of air surrounded by steel with enormous pressure, just getting greater and greater and greater as the sub sinks deeper and deeper. And then when it gets past its test depth, there's no longer any guarantee that the hull will hold beyond that point, but there's always some reserve built in there, so it goes down, down, down. And then when the sub hits crush depth, it implodes. And the crew is killed in a split second. As a matter of fact, they're killed before they know they're dead. And not to get too gruesome about this, but the reason it's instantaneous is that when that hull crushes, the air inside the hull is compressed to the point where it gets superheated. It's like maybe 1,000 degrees or something, and it's like an explosion inside the sub. It's just instant, lights out. So that sent a bit of a shock through the Navy. Here we are, USA, laughing at the Soviets with their boats that are leaking and spewing all this radiation, and we lose the ship of her class. So Thresher was the first of the Thresher-class subs, and you didn't want to name everything after that a Thresher-class sub after the Thresher was at the bottom of the ocean, so they renamed the class the Permit class after USS Permit, which was the second boat in the class. If that was a surprise, it was certainly more of a surprise in 1968 when 6 days after she was expected home, USS Scorpion was reported overdue. And when a nuclear sub is overdue, there's almost never good news following that. USS Scorpion was patrolling off the Azores. I want to say about 45 miles to the southwest, if memory serves, in any event, off the Azores. And she just didn't show up. She just never came home. Once they realized that she wasn't going to come home, Thresher went down in 8,000 feet, 8,400 feet. Scorpion went down in 9,800 feet, so nearly 10,000 feet. And with Scorpion, they were able to find the wreckage very quickly. And the reason they were able to find the wreckage quickly was by that time in 1968, the Navy has and continues to have a series of sonar sensors called the SOSUS system. It's basically started out as just between Greenland, Iceland, UK, but basically now the entire surface of the planet underwater is mic'd. We've got listening microphones, thousands and thousands of them, all across the planet. And when they realized that Scorpion wasn't coming back, they took a look at the window when she was missing, and sure enough, they found a small explosion, and then, depending on your source, a half a second later, another one. Some people say 20, 30 seconds later, a second one, and then a big boom. And since they detected this from many different sensors, they're able to triangulate the position, and that put it right over the wreck of the Scorpion. 99 guys went down with that boat. Same thing. Unlike Thresher, nobody really knows what's happened to Scorpion. That's still being hotly debated to this day. Some people say she was sunk by a Russian sub. I don't believe that. The Russians said that Kursk was sunk by colliding with an American sub, and they also said the same thing about a number of other boats. I just don't believe it. There's some talk about maybe a torpedo got ignited in the tubes, but the most likely event, I think, is the simplest, and that is that she probably experienced some kind of major or some kind of relatively minor flooding, and the flooding got down into the battery compartment, the emergency batteries. And once the water got in there, came into contact with these extremely high-powered batteries, generates a lot of hydrogen gas, and the slightest little spark or anything, boom, which sets up an internal explosion in the boat. Nobody really knows what happens. They just know there was an explosion inside the boat, then another one, and then the sound of her being crushed. And when they found her on the bottom, because she's a teardrop shaped like skipjack, the entire aft section of Scorpion is telescoped in. It's like if the sub originally looked like this, the whole back end is just crushed into the front from the water pressure. A giant piston like collapsing an old looking glass telescope. And so she's 10,000 feet down. And it's not widely known. It's fun to know. It's not a whole lot about this. It's fun, I guess, but it is kind of interesting to know that in 1986, Bob Ballard, went looking for Titanic. This is an internationally known expedition. Bob Ballard, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, is going to go out and he's going to see if he can find the Titanic. Well, as it turns out, he wasn't out there looking for the Titanic. He was out there photographing the wreckage of Thresher and photographing the wreckage of Scorpion in 1986. The Navy paid him to do this, and the Navy said, if you can get these pictures in time, then we'll give you whatever time is left on the mission for you to go look for Titanic. Turned out it was 12 days. After he got the pictures they wanted, the Navy wanted, he had 12 days left, and he went looking for the Titanic, and he found it. Anyway, Scorpion was a skipjack class boat. It was the third boat in the skipjack class series. So now we got 2 nuclear subs down. 4 submarines were lost in 1968. An Israeli sub went down. A French sub went down with 130 people, which beat the, I don't want to call it a record exactly, but it's the most expensive, it's the most deadly submarine disaster. A French sub went down in World War II. But another French sub went down in 68. And then also in 1968, K-129, which is a diesel-electric boat, not a nuclear sub, but it had 3 missiles in the sail. And it had a problem out in the Pacific and disappeared and sank. Thresher was in 8,000 feet. Scorpion's in 10,000. K-129 went down into 16,000 feet. I think Titanic's at 12,000. That's about as deep as it gets. K-129 went so deep that the Soviets never found her. They just never found the wreckage. Just disappeared off the face of the earth. At which point I go back to telling the SR-71 story. And then I tell a little bit about Pohound 1 and the CIA and some of the lighter things they do. I might even get into a little bit into Operation Bolo and Vietnam. And then, as we get towards the end of this episode, we come back to, I want to say it's about 1973, 73, 74, somewhere in there. I know the dates, I can find them. And the news that that eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes has decided that these magnesium nodules that are about this big, they're like pearls, but they take 1,000 years to form. It takes 1,000 years to put one layer. They just accrete metal. But the seafloor is littered with them. And it was a giant rush in the early 70s to realize that there were trillions of dollars of minerals just lying on the bottom of the ocean. And it took somebody as nutty as Howard Hughes to put money into going down there and scooping these things up and building a research ship. So he hired a company called Global Marine. They built a ship called the Glomar Challenger. Glomar Challenger, many of you have seen pictures of it. It's pretty famous ship. It had a derrick that you could use to drill with. They were first experiments in deep-sea drilling. And the Challenger had side propellers built into the bow and into the stern in addition to the main propeller. And because this thing had side thrusters, Glomar Challenger could stay over one spot and put an oil well down. So Hughes goes to these guys and says, hey, I want you to build me a ship to go scoop magnesium up off the floor. And we're going to have a gigantic scoop. It's going to be the size of a football bleachers. Huge. Manganese, sorry, not magnesium. Thank you, Dave Big Booty, as usual. Manganese nodules. So Hughes commissions Global Marine to design, I think Sun Shipping built it in Philadelphia, a ship called the Glomar Explorer, which became known as the Hughes Glomar Explorer. An enormous ship. Enormous. So big that you couldn't get the derrick out underneath these bridges, like the Brooklyn Bridge was too low. They basically had to leave the top of the derrick on its side. Whoops. Sail it out and then put the thing on once it got outside. Did I not say Explorer? I hope I did. Glomar, the Hughes Glomar Explorer. So Hughes sets out into the Pacific, and he's got his giant ship with a giant kind of a rake on the bottom, And he's going to sail out into the Pacific, and he's going to lower this thing down. He's going to scoop up these manganese modules off the bottom and make trillions and trillions of dollars. So he goes out there, and they report they have some problems doing it. And ship's out there for quite a long time. And he comes back, and it turns out that the thing they were using to scoop the stuff off the bottom of the ocean had broken and malfunctioned, so they didn't really have a whole lot to show when they came back, but they were going to go out and go again. But Howard Hughes was not the guy behind the mission. Howard Hughes was just helping out. The Glomar Explorer was built by the CIA. And the Glomar Explorer was built for one reason. It was a ship built for one mission. It was an enormous ship, huge. One mission. The mission of Glomar Explorer was to go out into the Pacific Ocean. We knew where K-129 was. We could tell where it was because we have these sonar things. We were able to triangulate the wreckage. We sent a submarine over that spot, took pictures. We found the Soviet sub on the bottom of the ocean, pretty nearly intact, lying on its side, and inside that submarine were Soviet missiles, Soviet warhead designs, Soviet code books, all of this stuff. It was 16,000 feet below the surface of the ocean, and the CIA decided to go get this sub. So the guy who ran the SR-71 program and the U-2 program, I want to say Patagonsky, something like that, put together a team that accomplished an engineering feat that certainly rivals the moon landing in terms of difficulty. They custom built this ship with this enormous derrick. The bottom of the ship opened up. Almost the entire front two-thirds of the ship would just open, leaving it open to the sea. You could drop a quarter off the inside of the boat and go all the way down to the bottom. As a matter of fact, when they got back to the Russian sub, as they were getting ready to lift it, they saw a hammer lying there. And they said, where the hell did this hammer come from? And they looked at all the original photographs that were taken when they discovered the location of this wreck. And there was no hammer in the pictures. And they said, what the hell happened? Turns out that a guy on the Explorer accidentally dropped a hammer overboard, and it fell 16,000 feet straight down and landed on the sub. That's how accurate this thing was. But the actual the RV recovery vehicle, the thing that actually grabbed the sub was in itself not only a piece of engineering, it was enormous. If you think about it, you're going to have a claw that's going to be big enough to grab an entire submarine and lift it up. Enormous. So how the hell do you get that thing on there? You can't build the ship around it because you've got satellites overhead and so on. So what the hell do you do? They built this claw in secret, and they built something called the Hughes submersible barge. It's apparently still in action. It's a gigantic, enormous structure, the barge. And it sinks because it completely submerged the thing. And they built the recovery vehicle, which they ended up calling Clementine, as the Explorer is being built. They built it on land, underneath cover. They put it onto the Hughes submersible barge, indoors, built the roof over the top, sailed the barge out to Catalina Island, of all places, in Isthmus Bay, right where where it's one island, but it comes within almost like 100 yards of being two islands. There's a little bay there. It's very deep, 500-600 feet, something like this. So this barge comes sailing out of San Francisco area, I think it was, and inside the barge is this mechanical claw that's going to pick up a sub. It's just the claw. Glomar Explorer is docked in Long Beach, and after a suitable amount of time goes by, they're going to take her out for her shakedown cruise, and they decide to anchor off the coast of Catalina, and in front of the entire world, with pleasure boats around, they had already taken the Hughes submersible barge, sunk it 400 or 500 feet down to the bottom of not to the bottom of the Pacific, but on the ledge there. They take the Explorer over this spot, open up the doors, reach down with their cabling, and grab onto the hook the claw, to Clementine, crank it up into the boat, close the doors, and sail away, and nobody was the wiser. Nobody had any idea. No one. Just, yeah. They did it in a couple of hours. In itself is a miracle. When you see the size of the Hughes submersible barge, it's absolutely enormous. And this Clementine has got to look like, the closest thing I can get you to it is, imagine like a high school football game. And you have these two bleachers that run down, for 30, 50, 60, 70 yards on a side. These two bleachers. Now, if you imagine that you move those things closer together a little bit, maybe half the distance, and then turn it upside down, these rows and rows and yards of bleachers, that's what Clementine was. Enormous. So they get this thing on board and they sail out over the Pacific, pretending like they're looking for manganese. And Howard Hughes is an engineer, and anytime people would ask questions, they'd say, well, this is what Mr. Hughes wants, and he's very protective about his secrecy. And they get over this spot on the Pacific Ocean, and then they start screwing in these sections of pipe onto Clementine, and they start letting her down to the bottom. Takes a week. They know where she is. The first thing they have to do is they have to drop these sonobuoys, these little hydraulic sensors, so they know how much the ship is moving. In 1974, when this happened, they were able to keep that ship, that enormous ship, within 1 foot of where it needed to be, and that was without GPS. 1 foot. So they send this thing down. Claws open. It's got these huge legs next to it. They're directly over the sub. The actual Clementine, it's an enormous steel structure. It's like launching high school bleachers into the water. It's huge. They've got little vast amounts of searchlights and cameras everywhere, and then they've got propellers on there so that they can actually fly this thing around a little bit. They position it over the sub. They built models of the sub. They'd taken thousands of photographs of this sub. They had to know every single thing about where this sub was, what the dimensions were, what was the slope of everything. The only thing they didn't get was they didn't get a soil sample. They didn't get a sample of how thick the muck was underneath K-129. That just part of the mission they just didn't do. They couldn't get it done. Something malfunctioned. So they put the claw over K-129. They sink it over the sub. The tines of the claws start to close. And they find that instead of being filled with muck, because they thought they'd have a big problem with suction, sucking this thing, the mud would suck onto it, pulling this thing out of the muck. They thought it was going to be a gigantic issue. Turns out there was almost no mud at all. It was almost all like practically solid rock. So these claws close around the sub, and once they're closed, the four legs around Clementine extend down into the seabed, and then they ratchet themselves up, which is what pulls the submarine out of the muck. And once it's free, the legs stay there, and then the claw just brings this entire submarine to the surface. I forget how much it weighed. It was, I think, 1 million pounds, maybe a little more, something like that. And all this time, there's a Soviet, like a tug. It's obviously a surveillance boat, and they're hassling them. They're getting within 50 yards. They're just constantly darting around back and forth, back and forth. They don't even know if they're going to be boarded or not. This is clearly an act of war, or at least it could certainly be construed to be. Although the U.S. legal claim was, well, the Soviets abandoned it. They stopped looking for it, so it's finders keepers. So these guys who've worked on this project, including many of the guys that worked on the U-2 and the SR-71, are absolutely astonished that this thing has worked. They're doing field repairs on it the whole time. Some people pointed out in the comment section the biggest bearings ever manufactured, ever, were built for this ship. Because not only did the boat have to stay in position over the wreck, the boat would be pivoting, which meant that the entire rig had to be able to pivot in those directions, and furthermore, as a wave would lift the Explorer up and bring her back down again, that would be transmitted down to the claw, but you couldn't have that. The claw had to stay constant height above the sub. And so they also had these hydraulic compensators that took out the up and down motion. These things work so well that some of the engineers would go to the top of the derrick in rough seas, and the whole boat's pitching and rolling, and they're up on the top of this gigantic derrick. They're hundreds and hundreds of feet above the surface of the water, and it's just smooth as can be, just like absolutely rock solid. And same thing down below. So these guys cannot believe they've actually pulled this off. They can't believe it. The boat, the sub is 16,000 feet below the water. So, in very round numbers, I should find this out. Give me 1 second. This will be very easy. I like to use things that people can relate to. Okay. So, from the bottom, from the sidewalk to the top of the radio antenna on the Empire State Building is 1,400 feet. Close enough. The boat, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, is 10 or 11 Empire State Buildings stacked one on top of each other. That's how high it is. That's how deep the sub is. 10 or 11 Empire State Buildings, straight up. And they said that in order to fully understand what they did, you need to think of it this way. To scale, they said what they accomplished was, if they'd gone to the top of the Empire State Building, to the observation deck, had taken a 1-inch thick cable, lowered it to the street, used a claw attached to that cable to pick up a Toyota Camry, and the Toyota Camry was filled with gold, that's how heavy it was, and then crank that car all the way back up to the top. That's the actual scale of the challenge they had to face. So these guys cannot believe it. They cannot believe it. They've done it. They pulled it off. So they're slowly bringing this sub up, and then they're going to open the bays, and they're going to pull her in, and then they're going to close the bays, and they're just going to sail back home, and nobody's going to know. And they're going to make another press announcement. They were handing out these manganese modules, in glass cases to reporters. Probably even more amazing than engineering is the cover story. Nobody ever got it. The Russians, there was one Russian admiral who kept saying, the Americans are poking around where we lost this sub, and I don't like it. And they were being told, no, we couldn't even find it. There's nothing, you can't salvage something from 16,000 feet. It's far, 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 far too deep for divers or diving bells. Forget it. They're just out there looking for manganese. Anyway, they're pulling this thing up, and they get the sub 9,000 feet above the surface of the 9,000 feet above the ocean floor, which is more than halfway to the surface. And they're just slowly, one at a time, pulling up this cable and unfastening it and stowing it, and pulling it up and unfastening it and stowing it. And they're in the middle of the lift. They're more than halfway. They're home free. Everybody's basically relaxing. They've got the champagne bottles back at Langley. Everybody's popping corks. They're getting ready for the big moment. And at 9,000 feet above the bottom of the ocean, all of a sudden, Glomar Explorer has this gigantic lurch, like it hit something. And that's not good. So what happened? Well, the guys who are running the back of the claw are looking around, or the front of the claw rather, saying everything looks good to us, but something's happened. Something big has happened. And what happened was K-129, the steel that they used for the hooks, for the tines, the parts that actually closed around the sub, were made from a kind of steel that was going to be obviously the best steel they could find for this particular lift. But the one thing that they haven't counted on, because of that one malfunction 4 or 5 years ago when they were supposed to get a sample of the seabed and they didn't, what they did was they got the strongest steel they could find, but what they really needed was the most flexible steel they could find, because the thing that screwed this thing up was when they got to the sub, there was essentially no muck, no sand on the bottom, nothing soft. So these tines on Clementine had to scrape against rock, and as they closed around the submarine, it put some cracks into some of the tines because of the kind of steel. If they'd used a more flexible steel, it would have been fine. But they weren't going for flexibility. They're going for strength. And they didn't know that there wouldn't be any soft muck under the thing. They thought their big challenge would be sucking this thing out of the mud. So they know something's happened. And then it dawns on them that at least 2/3 of the submarine has broken and fallen away. 2 or 3 of those steel tines that were holding the sub had fractured. They broke loose, or at least opened up. The sub slipped out through the bottom. Not all of it. They still had the front third of the boat. But the sail was gone. Inside the sail was where the missiles were. The missiles were gone. The code books, which were in the communications room, gone. All of the stuff they'd gone to the trouble to lift up to the surface. And a couple hours before they get it in the boat, Clementine fractures some of these fingers, and down it goes. And all of the CIA guys in Washington, everybody's having this just literal disbelief that they actually pulled this thing off. Now realize that probably 80 or 90% of the intelligence that they wanted from that boat had slipped out and gotten away, gone back down to the bottom of the ocean. The mission directors at Langley immediately sent a message saying, bring up the part you've got and then go down and get the rest of it. It's not a request, it's not advice. Find out, get what you can off of the front, but since the stuff we want has fallen out of this claw and gone back down to the bottom of the ocean, go back down and pick it up. And they're saying, well, first of all, we got the Soviets and all this other stuff out here, but secondly, the thing is broken. It's broken. We can't go down and pick it up. There's nothing to pick it up with. The claws are broken. And it slowly, over the course of a day or so, dawns on all of the people involved with this mission that they'd gotten so close and yet so far. But the story's not done yet. They winched the sub up, and they opened the doors on the bottom of the Explorer, and that open area they called the moon pool. And as they're looking down at this cable, they begin to see this form, and they pull this thing up, pull it up, and they've got the front third of K-129. They pull it all the way up into the bay, still in the front part of Clementine, close the doors underneath the moon pool, drain out the water, and there it is. And these guys start putting on these, these biosuits, contamination suits, tape them all up, and they start getting into that sub and trying to find what they can find. It turns out that they found some stuff that was interesting, but the actually even better stuff is kind of still coming. So they get on board this Soviet boat, and they find assorted body parts, but they also find more or less intact 3 skeletons, 3 bodies from 3 Russian sailors. So they take those bodies out of there. One of them was in a bunk reading a manual. The manual proved to be relatively valuable intelligence too, but he was reading a manual and found him in his bunk, which told everybody that whatever happened on K-29 happened real fast, because if your boat's on fire and sinking, you don't stay in a bunk reading a manual. So to their great credit, I always thought, they took very special care with these 3 skeletons and with whatever other body parts they found. They started to pick apart the part of the K-129 that they did get. They got some interesting intelligence out of it, certainly not what they wanted. And then before they left, they had constructed a steel box, painted the top of it scarlet red, same color as the Soviet flag. And they didn't have the flag of the Soviet Union on board, but they did have the flag of the Soviet Navy. And in the moon pool, I think it was in the moon pool, in this giant hole in the side of this boat, the entire crew of the Explorer gathers, and they had a Russian, I think some kind of translator on board to help with translating the materials they found. And so the 3 bodies that they'd recovered, they bring out of the morgue, covered in the flag of the Soviet Navy, and then they very gently lay these 3 bodies wrapped in white shrouds inside this red kind of a case. And as they're doing it, they play the American national anthem, they play the Russian national anthem. They say prayers in Russian. Everybody's standing at attention. They close the cases on this thing, and the guy who wrote the book, The Taking of 129, he said they then lifted this case up on a winch and lowered it into the water as carefully as you can on a winch, as gently as you could. And you can find this, by the way. Footage is declassified. You go to YouTube and just look for Burial at Sea K19. I'm sorry, K129, or Burial at Sea for the name of the project, which I should have mentioned at the beginning. This entire project was called Project Azorian, as in the Azores. Project Azorian, Burial at Sea. You can see the actual video, which was shot in 1974. And you can see this thing submerging back into the water. So they've got what they could get, and they start coming back to port. And somehow they had managed to keep this cover story intact. Every now and then a little leak would get out, but they decided to just ignore it. Just don't pour any fuel on it. Before the ship went out, what's his name? Herb, investigative reporter, Hertz, Stan Hertz, is that it? Some investigative reporter, I want to say for the Washington Post, got wind of the story and had published in the Post, I think it was on the front page, a sort of a general, here's what we think is going on kind of thing. And they basically, the CIA went to this guy, to this reporter, top-level CIA guys went and sat him down, and they read him into the program. They read this investigative reporter. They told him everything about the mission, everything. And they asked him, please, this is more important than a news story. This is a national security issue. This is Cold War. This is ability to defend against incoming Soviet missiles. This is all of it. We need this data. They said, if you sit on the story, we promise you will get all of the information first. We'll give you everything we got. Once the story's broken, you can have everything. So Sid Hirsch, that sounds right. So he agreed. He decided not to. They just let the story die, just like it never happened. And the Soviet Navy got a hold of the story and said, it's just kind of speculation, some kind of weird stuff. He's looking for manganese. The K-19's, K-129 is at 16,000 feet. You can't even find it, let alone touch it. So they managed to sit on the story, and they sail the Explorer back to the mainland, and they're deciding, all right, damn it, let's go get it. Let's go get the stuff that we came looking for. Let's go out again. They had to launch. They only had a 2-week window because of weather, and they thought if we have to wait another year, there's no way we can keep this under wraps. There's like 400 guys on the boat or something, and they're just regular, merchant marine guys who they selected as best they could and basically read them into this top secret program. And so they're getting ready to go out again. And these leaks start springing up. And the CIA is running around doing the same thing they did with her, saying, LA Times, look, here's what we're doing. And here's why it's important. Can you please bury the story until the time comes? And in 1974, before the press was completely at war with the country, they did. They killed the story. Except for one guy, I don't know how conservative he was. I just know he was a Mormon. And his name was Jack Anderson. And he was one of these guys who are kind of on independent radio. He was kind of a wildcatter. He's an awful lot like Alex Jones. A very similar kind of guy. almost identical kind of guy. And he had a radio show where he's reporting on all of this boondoggle spending and so on and so on. And he gets wind of the story. And he has a Saturday radio show, nationally syndicated radio show. And the agency gets to him, I don't know, half an hour before he goes on the air, tells him the whole thing, gives him the whole thing, why they need to keep the story quiet. And Anderson basically says, nope, to hell with you. Goes on the air, tells him everything that happened. And that was the end of Project Matador, which was the attempt to go out for a second time and get what was supposed to have been gotten on Project Azorian. That is an astonishing story. It's just, it's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. But it happened. It's true. If you want to go to YouTube, search for something called Azorian. Somebody, I think, put out a documentary. I haven't seen the documentary, but if you search for on YouTube Azorian: The Final Days, I want to say. Man, I'm tempted. You know what? I'm going to get it right now. Stay with us. Don't go away. I hate doing this in the middle of a show, but in this case, it's worth it because it's got about 3 minutes of computer graphics, and unless you see it, you really just can't believe what it's about. Give me a second here, see if I can find this, download it, and I'll pop it into the screen here. That is obviously copyright of Michael White or whoever owns it. It's marvelous work, and I just think it should be seen by more people. I'm sorry about the sound. I couldn't do anything about it. Babyface Nelson, it's such a great experience having an audience like this. That's much better than I deserve, honestly. Babyface Nelson in the comments section points out something that when they were talking about whether or not they'd done this, the CIA tried to figure out what they were going to do. They found out from the U-2 back in 1960 with Khrushchev that what Khrushchev was most upset about was not that the Americans were spying on his country. He knew that we were basically in the Cold War and he expected us to do that. The thing that Khrushchev was most upset about was that once they shot down the U-2, Eisenhower got on television and said, yes, we did the whole thing. And that humiliated the Soviets publicly in front of their own people. And that was the one thing they could not have. It was one thing to be embarrassed and humiliated if the Americans stole something out from under their nose. But as long as they weren't public about it, and it didn't become an international news story, they could at least keep it from their own people. And that's exactly what they did. So when the CIA was trying to figure out what kind of statement they could make, they didn't want to be accused of lying in terms of the court of law, and at the same time, they didn't want to admit that they did it because they didn't want to embarrass the Soviets any further than they already had, and this whole thing was pretty iffy anyway in terms of legal justification and so on. And so they came up with a statement that eventually became known as the Glomar exception, thanks to Babyface Nelson, who reminded me about this. And basically, the Glomar exception was the now famous phrase, "We can neither confirm nor deny that we went out there looking for this submarine." They had to find a way so that they weren't lying, and at the same time, they weren't telling the truth. They weren't admitting it, but they weren't denying it either. We can neither confirm nor deny that we went looking for this submarine. I may end up taking this episode of the Stratosphere Lounge, and instead of uploading it immediately, I'll just go in tomorrow, and I'll strip the sound out of that one section, because YouTube listens for sound. In any event, they weren't able to go back and get it, but you could see from that incredible 3D graphics the scale of this thing, the scale of it. The audacity of it. So, I'm sitting here thinking, go USA. Aren't we awesome? Look at that. We went 16,000 feet at the bottom of the ocean. We took this enormous structure, went down there, scooped this thing up. Soviets not only didn't even know about it, they told their own guys not to worry about it because our cover story was so great. And Hughes was the perfect cover guy because Hughes was nutty enough to do it. So finally in 1974, the story breaks and there's no going back. And so now they can, reveal it. And true to their word, the CIA gave Hirsch all of the inside stuff and thanks for sitting on the story and so on. But here's what I had to endure. After reading this incredible story and being filled so much with pride and the magnitude of what this was the single greatest intelligence operation in the history of mankind in terms of scale and difficulty. And they pulled it off. They may not have pulled all of it off, but they got some of that sub up there. And I'm so proud of this, as an American. And then I realized that the amount of information that we got off of that boat was significant, but was nothing in comparison to the amount of information that the Soviets got from a chief petty officer named Walker, who was a wife beater and a failure, and he was a communications specialist, and he gave the Soviet Union over 1 million top secret American messages, propeller designs, reactor designs, how we would mount equipment on board the boat so it wouldn't vibrate, so we would make it silent. All of this, all of the work, all of the technology, all of the lead that we had, all of it. He just gave it to them for $130,000. That's why he did it. It wasn't like he was a red diaper baby like the Rosenbergs or anything. He just wanted the money. And so he didn't walk out with $1.3 billion. He ended up with $130,000 or something. He endangered every single person in this country. He gave away this bitter, broken loser. The point I'm trying to make is, we spent, I think the final cost on Azorian was over $100 million, was probably nearly $200 million or something like that. And we have this incredible operation to get this intelligence. And the Soviets pay $130,000 to this guy. And he gives them 20 times the information we got off of K-129. Died in prison. Robert Walker Jr.? Is that it? I know it was Walker. The world is a strange place. And this constantly comes back up to me when I'm writing about this Cold War thing. Is this weird sort of balance? It's almost like there are fingers on both ends of the scale, making it, So we've got this incredible Nautilus, and it's just perfect, and it's brand new, and the first Soviet boat is this death trap, and it's killed all these sailors and everything. Yoo-hoo! And then Thresher goes down, and then Scorpion goes down. And then the Soviets lose a missile boat. And we use our amazing technology once again to lift the bloody submarine from 16,000 feet off the bottom of the ocean, lift millions of pounds of submarine up into a ship, and nobody knows it. There's a Soviet intelligence trawler 50 yards away from the Glomar Explorer, and they have no idea that we're lifting their submarine off the bottom of the ocean. And you think, wow. And then you've got this bitter loser who basically, there's some speculation that mostly it's leaning against it now, but you never know with these things. When was this? Sorry. I gotta know. Give me 1 second. 1 second. This will be very fast. Hang on. Yeah, 1968. In 1968, an intelligence ship called USS Pueblo is stationed off of North Korea in international waters. The North Koreans come after it. They basically take it over. The guys on board the Pueblo are trying to scrap as much intelligence as they possibly can, but they're not really prepared for this. The North Koreans take the boat, and they get some of our cryptography devices. And one of the things that I had read, Walker was doing this well before Project Azorian. speculation was that this thing, and this is, you want to talk about an act of war. I mean, the North Koreans sailed out into international waters and boarded and took over an American naval vessel, and there's nothing we could do about it. We didn't have anybody with any guns nearby. They sail it into port. They parade the crew down the streets, and all the Koreans. This is 20 years after the Korean Wars ended, and there's a fair amount of speculation that the reason that they went that far out on a limb, it was so important for them that they had to get that cryptography device so that they could, hey, we're good, thanks. We're fine, thank you. Have a good night. The reason that they had to do it was because they needed this decoding device in order to really fully confirm what Walker was giving them. 1 million messages over the course of whatever it was, 8 years, 10 years. And it wasn't just him. He'd gotten involved with another couple guys, and his son was involved. And you just look at a picture, just go find Walker. He's just this, I mean, what do you say? It's kind of like looking at John F. Kennedy and then looking at Lee Harvey Oswald, and you think, really? Is that really? Yeah, apparently so. Anyway, it's 8:05, and I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't take some questions, but I think that's pretty much the main story for the night. So, needless to say, looking forward to recording that, and they're going to start airing episode 1 of the podcast, I want to say in January 20th, something like that, and then one a week for 12 weeks, of which this will be part 9. So, I don't go into that kind of detail on Azorian. But it's fun to do. All right, so let me just get a couple of these real quick, just so I can say that I did. Okay, where is it? Oh, because I have to refresh them at the page. Submarine Night on the Stratosphere Lounge. Yeah, that's amazing, amazing stuff. Really good stuff.